And so the way we're going to work this, and a quick word of explanation, perhaps you've already had, but Gary is completely deaf right now. His cochlear implant needs an upgrade, and he can't get that appointment until early October, so he is totally deaf. But what we're going to do is I'm going to ask questions of Gary that are printed on cards so that he can then go ahead and tell his story. If you see that there's a problem, if you'll just wave at us and we'll stop. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and go with this. A real quick word of introduction. I came to know Gary about 2 years ago. I have a little podcast for horror stories called Dark Corners, and Gary reached out to me and said, "Did you know there's a real Dark Corners?" And he began to tell me about a story that he had written about Lewis Redmond, an outlaw who lives in dark corners in the northeast corner of Georgia. Well, we started the friendship, and then we realized that Gary, as a storyteller, was losing ground with being able to not be mobile. He was pretty much restricted to a wheelchair, and couldn't go to so many events to do his storytelling. And we thought, well, maybe there's an outlet for him. So we created a podcast, and we've been looking for different ways to let him continue telling his stories. So one of the things I wanted to start with is a question for Gary. I'm going to hand him the card, and then I'm going to read it, and then I'll let him tell that. But I'm asking Gary, what events in your life were most important in making you a storyteller?
Well, it seems to me that the events that are most important in my life and in the way I become a storyteller are all sad things, tragic in a way. It begins with my father's murder when I was 2 years old. And then after my mother left me with my grandparents, paternal grandparents, she went to Knoxville and didn't come back. And then I had polio, which messed me up, and I developed scoliosis, which is a spinal thing. But there's something good about it. My spinal polio got me a scholarship from vocational rehab. So I went to college after all on vocational rehab. After that, I would say the most important thing that happened to me is that I worked for the Cherokees for 15 years as a grants writer, and I started telling stories essentially all the time. Anywhere I could reach somebody, I would tell stories. I did it for 50 years. Okay.
I want to follow up with a question that's out of order with the way we had actually practiced our talk. And I want to ask you about the role that movies had for you, the theater, but going to the movies. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
I got a job at the theater when I was just a little kid. The man that ran the Ritz Theater hired me to change the marquee on the front of the theater. There was big letters on the top of the theater that told you what the movie was and who was in it, stars and so forth. He said, "Gary, change the letters, put up what's coming, next attractions, sweep the theater up, pop all the popcorn, and I'll let you see all the movies free." And I thought that was a great deal. I don't know whether you agree, but I saw every movie that was at the Ritz Theater from the time I was about 12 until I was a teenager.
And did you not end up retelling the movie's plot to your classmates?
The plain truth is I told stories because I attracted attention. I found out at a very early age that if I told my classmates everything that happened in the Saturday Western, they would sit there and listen to me. And lo and behold, if people will look at me and listen to what I say, I'll tell stories the rest of my life. And of course, I graduated from the Saturday Westerns to stories about my own family. and then finally about my own peculiar life. The first story that I told that I thought was significant is I told a tragic story. It was my father's death and the fact that my grandmother had to go to a nursing home. And when I told that story, I got 100 responses from people who said, yes, I put my grandmother in a nursing home too. Mm-hmm. Suddenly we had something in common. And that's the whole point of telling stories. It's much like when I went to governor's school, and yes, I was actually at governor's school. They called me the hillbilly, but I was there, and I directed drama for a year at the governor's school. And when I was doing that, I did my own play, and I got away with it. I did the insect comedy, which is rarely ever done, which is a strange play with all the characters are insects that I'll talk about sometimes. Essentially, when I got away with telling the story about my grandmother, then I learned to tell stories about my family. And I just started doing that regularly, and I was astonished to discover that it was good material. My Uncle Albert was a great story. My family was a great story, sometimes in an unpleasant way. Suddenly the stories were just rolling in. When I went to governor's school, they once did a little demonstration, which I thought was very significant. They rolled a piano out in the center of the stage, and they took a guitar and put it way out in the audience, propped it up in a chair, and then they went back to the piano and they played one chord, whoom. The interesting thing was that chord repeated on that guitar, boom. In other words, it was an echo. And I think that's what's important about storytelling. That's what your job is, to get an echo from somebody. Somebody hears what you're talking about and they respond. I also was a great fan for, who's the guy that did the mythology series?
Oh, now that you say it, the name doesn't come to my mind. But yes, who was so famous about that and gave us the idea of the hero's quest and basically
he
every
said
plot.
that the thing about stories, fairy tales, he says we're drawing from the same well. Everybody in the world is telling the same stories. Right. And when we told a story like Snow White, there's a Japanese Snow White, an Italian Snow White, and an Eskimo Snow White, and they all have essentially the same plot. We're telling the same stories, just from different cultures. And he frequently said, if you find the story that illustrates your life, say like, I asked a woman named Piccola Estes, who was a famous storyteller, and I said, what is the value of a story that reflects your own life? Like, okay, here's a story about a homeless child or a child that never had a home. In a strange way, that story will tell you how to live your life. And I really believe that. I believe it's true for me. I remember she sent me a story that was about an Eskimo child that everybody was in the family was killed by polar bears, and he was the only thing left alive, and they took this kid with no family and put him in the center of town, and he would say when people went by, feed me, feed me, feed me. And sometimes they would throw him food, but eventually they ignored him, and one night he was sitting there saying, feed me, and a tear came out of his eye, and it came down and it fell on the vase or the food plate that he had that was empty. And a little woman suddenly stepped out of the plate and said, I've been waiting for you. She says, come on. I'll show you how to build an igloo. I'll show you how to fish. Essentially, listen to your inner mother. She will tell you how to live and where to go and what to do.
Nice, nice. You know, for everybody that was probably in the audience mentally screaming at us, it's Joseph Campbell that we were trying to think of. And I knew that's who you were talking about.
Joseph Campbell,
Yeah, it's taken a while for me to get there. But that idea that stories resonate with someone else, that a storyteller's story can resonate with someone else is so important. And I think that's probably a reason for your success too. But also the fact that you can tell stories so well and capture the culture of a people. And I wondered if you would just say a word again about mountain culture. What is unique about mountain culture? Or do you think that there is something that's unique? Is that you said people often
I think the true mountain culture is strongly personal. It's your own life that is your own culture, you know. That's what I had to discover. I had to just turn around and tell my own family story from the standpoint that we were mountain culture. And the things we were doing was what mountain culture did.
And Gary, you've had to overcome some prejudices, I believe. And one thing that I've always enjoyed hearing, although it was kind of sad in a way, but you made it a humorous idea. When you were in college, you had an instructor who said something to you that you've never forgotten, and it was about your accent. Can you share that?
Yeah, she was from Mexico, and she taught drama, which is the one thing I was interested in and the only reason I was in college, really. But I asked a question one morning, and she looked at me and she says, "Gary, when you speak, I shudder." That's my mountain accent.
Yeah, it's a shame, but actually that turned into being your trademark, and you were such a spokesperson for mountain culture in a very genuine way. And I think it's a good thing that you didn't totally get rid of that accent and that you were able to embrace it and share with others about mountain culture and your personal history and personal story. Can I ask you this? You've told so many stories over the years to so many different people. What is your favorite, what do you think has been people's favorite story to hear?
Well, the story that defined me is mason jars in the flood. Am I talking too loud? Can y'all?
I think no, you're good. So please tell us that story.
When my grandfather built the house that I'm living in now, and that was 100 years ago. See, I'm 90 years old, and I've lived in this house for most of my life. I've gone and taught school other places, but I always ended up coming back here. And he always regretted the fact that he didn't finish the attic. The attic was just a big empty room, and it was full of old grit stacked it up in the corner, and where we put places, things that we didn't know what else to do with. And there were a lot of musical instruments up there. And he developed an obsession with building his bedroom up there, but it would just be his. And it just never happened. He never reached a point financially where he could finish that attic and build a bedroom. But he had a feather bed up there, and it was against the wall. And on rainy nights, he would go up there and get in that feather bed, where he could lay and hear the water drum on the tin roof that was just outside the window. And that was one of the greatest thrills of his life, his greatest pleasure, is to lie in that feather bed and listen to the rain fall. And I used to go with him. I don't think he was necessarily happy about that, but I was troubled. I was afraid of the wasps. The attic was full of wasps. If you've ever been stung by a wasp, it's an unforgettable experience. It is a hurt that you cannot forgive. And my Uncle Albert said once, a wasp is born mad, lives mad, and dies mad. That's true. And there I was listening to those wasps buzz around that dark ring, you know, like helicopters. You know, like they were looking for a place to land. And my granddaddy says, Garneal, that's what he called me. He never liked my name. My name is Gary Neal. My grandfather said, Garneal, hush. Just don't talk. Get in the bed if you're going to get there. Leave the wasps alone. It'll be okay. And so I did. I crawled into bed with him and went to sleep immediately and dreamed of cowboys. But sometime during the night, all hell broke loose. The walls shook, the windows shook, the rain was coming down unusually hard, and it was shaking the house. And we woke up, and my granddaddy said, cloudburst, which is a special kind of a storm. And I'll define it. It defines itself. He gets up, gets his big flashlight that has 4 batteries in it, goes down and stands on the porch and shines the light into the yard. And that flashlight just goes a few feet. It is raining so hard, there's a solid wall of water out there. And I turn around and come down the steps, and there's my grandmother. She does the same thing anytime there's trouble. She cooks. And she's already fixing breakfast, you know, and I can smell biscuits and I can smell coffee. And I go out with the porch with my grandfather, and while I'm standing out there, I look, and a river comes out of the pasture. There was not a stream for it to be followed. That was dry pasture. It come pushing walnuts and trash, jumped the road and come down into the yard, and then he went down the branch in front of my house. And he just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I got on the edge of the porch where I could see real well. And I decided that I had a role to play. It was to tell my grandparents what was in that flood. And so I'm saying, dead chicken, there went a dead chicken. Oh, walnuts, lots of walnuts. Potatoes, lumber. A whole lumber yard went by. Must have been somebody's outhouse, I guess. People are losing stuff above me, and it's coming down. And I was telling everybody what was coming down, and my grandmother came out and said, Garneal, hush. Everybody in this cove thinks there's a crazy person living here. You're hollering about death and destruction. For heaven's sake, hush. And I said, yes, Mama, because I did call her Mama. And I did. I hushed, and she went back in the house and went on with the cooking. And suddenly my granddaddy says, I'm worried about the cow, Agnes. And she says, yeah, she's over there in that barn, and the water is already up in the barn. He says, come on, we've got to take her to higher ground. And I said, I'll go with you. And he looked at me and he says, no, Garneal, you stay here. And so I watched my grandmother and my grandfather wade away into the pasture and down to the barn, and they got the cow out and took her somewhere high up the ridge where the water wouldn't get to her. And it is at that point when I was sitting there watching everything go through that flood as fast as it could, that I had what I later called an epiphany. I had an awakening. I saw a wondrous opportunity to find playmates, somebody to tell stories to and make slingshots and so forth. So I went down to my granny's canning house, and I got her mason jars, and I brought them up and I lined them on the porch, you know, mason jars across the porch. And then I got my Blue Horse notebook, and I sat down and I wrote notes. And what I wrote was, hello, my name's Gary Neal. I live in Rhodes Cove. I read Superman. I read Wonder Woman. I listen to Squeaking Door. I drink RC Colas. Come and play with me. And then I rolled that note up and I put it in that jar, and I screwed the lid on it, and I put the rubber seal on it, and I threw it out there in that storm, and it went bouncing away down the road. Gone. I threw all my granny's mason jars away, and there they went. She asked me the next day when I was sitting on the porch, "What are you looking down that drowned cornfield for? You think you're going to see my jars someplace? You going to bring them back?" I says, "No, Mama, I'm looking for a playmate." And I explained to her, somebody's going to find my jar, and they're going to come up that trail right there. They'll come up that trail, and they'll come up here to the foot of the steps, and they say, "Gary, now look, I've got your jar." And I said, "You do? Come on in. I'll find the funny books." And so I told my Uncle Albert, he was the best uncle I ever had. He actually liked me a little bit. I said, "Albert, where are my jars now, do you think?" He said, "Well, they probably made it to the Mississippi, and from there they'll go to the Gulf of Mexico." This is before Trump changed everything, of course. "And out here, somewhere, they're still going, maybe in the Pacific Ocean." And I said, "Where do you think they are?" And he says, "I think they might even be in Alpha Centauri." And I knew about Alpha Centauri because he told me about that, another planet somewhere. And I told him, I said, "Albert, I dreamed about my favorite actress last night." I forgot her name. Oh, yeah. I dreamed about Deborah Passant. She was in Broken Arrow. She played a blue-eyed Indian, and I loved her. She's wonderful. And she came up the trail last night. I dreamed it. She came up the trail, and she had one of my jars. And she come here to the foot of the steps, and she said, "I have one of your jars, Garnale. Let's play." And I told Uncle Albert about her coming, and he says, "Yeah, kid, we've all got to have a dream, don't we?"
That's wonderful. That's such a great story. It's no mystery as to why that's many people's favorite story. So I appreciate that you shared that with us. Thanks, Gary.